I'm live. Good morning. It is Wednesday morning and it's the 12th of June 2024. And I'm reading The Laird and the Lady. I used to read it on my Hector Recreates page, but I have to have a minimum of 100 subscribers or something. Suddenly it doesn't let me record there anymore, so I have to do it on this page. And I continue reading. This is a novel by Joan Marshall Grant, published in 1949. She was a writer of her own far memories. She wrote 7 books of her incarnations in Egypt, in Italy, in Greece. Wonderful books. This here is her one and only novel. She passed away in 1989. We are in the third part of this book, and it's chapter 5. Entitled New Year's Eve. The 7 American guests whom Marylda had invited to the New Year's party imagined they were enjoying a standard of hospitality commonplace at Cloud. This was an unconscious tribute to teamwork, which, as Rowan said to Sandy, was worthy of the tradition of D-Day. It was the pride of the staff, inside and outside, that the arrangements appeared smooth as a skater's waltz, and only within the closed circle was it admitted that at times the ice had been perilously thin. Even the Scottish guests must not be told how narrowly minor disasters had been avoided. The Mexican band, which was to play between the reels for which 6 pipers had been lent by Rowan's old regiment, had left the London train at Aviemore instead of Inverness, and had been rescued from a chilly exile in the waiting room by a flying squad of the Rolls and a shooting brake. The Orchids, sent from America by Mr. Grummet, had gone to the wrong airfield and had been brought to Cloud by Duncan. One of the hired waiters had arrived so drunk that he had been given in charge of Anderson until he could be put on the train, with no more than a third-class ticket and a black eye for his trouble. Sandy, now raised to the stature of butler, had trained 2 footmen with a precision that would have been respected even by a sergeant major of the brigade, who might not have thought of the nicety of making recruits run downstairs carrying 2 raw eggs on a silver tray and finding them 6p for every broken shell. They were too big for the livery, which had been stored away for nearly half a century. So Agnes, now head housemaid of 3, and Elsie, who had become Marylda's lady's maid, added a rider to their prayers that no one would notice the difference in the shade of green, where seams had been let out and holes meticulously darned. Only Mrs. McTaggart was unruffled. At first she had inwardly rebelled at the invasion of 2 chefs hired from a famous London restaurant, but under her compelling eye they had abandoned their Italian accent, learned in a school in Soho, and became her obedient, if unwilling, slaves. Let them make their flummery of spun sugar and ice pudding. To her was the honour of the dinner haggis and grouse. In comfortable security of a position successfully defended, she permitted herself half an hour's relaxation in the housekeeper's room. Her black glace slippers, whose buttoned straps were too tight for her swollen insteps, stood precise by the polished brass fender, and a pot of strong tea was convenient on the table beside her armchair. Elsie, who had proved by intensive reconnaissance that the underclothes of her lady were superior to anything the foreigners could produce, was in the lad's room, laying out Marylda's white satin dress. Sandy was in the cellar, counting for the 5th time the cases of champagne, to make sure that none of the intruders had managed to discover where he had hidden the key, under the cellar book, instead of on its customary nail behind the door of the butler's pantry. Robbie was given an extra spoonful of black treacle to his pipes, and making sure that the reeds of his drones were exactly tuned. He then gave himself a dram of whisky, so that there should be nothing lacking in his performance, when at last he again assumed the role of family piper. The house party were having tea in the drawing room, Marylda carrying out the elaborate ritual of silver kettle and tortoise-shell caddy, Queen Anne teapots and sugar tongs, as though this were a daily occurrence instead of a technique recently taught by Georgina. Rowan was trying to pretend that he found the recital of fox hunting in Virginia recounted with a plethora of detail by Henry Byrne III, who had once been a suitor of Marylda's of absorbing interest, and hoping that no one guessed that at the same time he was mentally ticking off a list of things which had been given into his care over a fortnight ago. Sea boiler is made up every hour. Will the hot water hold out? Whiskey for band, but not too much before supper. Remind Sandy to have bread, salt, and coal ready for the dark man to bring it in at midnight. Must ask Janet to dance the second foursome with me, and remind Marylda that she must ask Mr. Henderson. She might think that ministers don't dance reels, but he fancies himself as an expert. Need I ask the American woman to join in the reels? Or would they know they were making asses of themselves? Tell Sandy not to let Mrs. McTaggart put too much nutmeg in the mulled claret, and to use only the Algerian. Georgina, who found some of the guests uncomfortably reminiscent of Emilie, had spent the afternoon fishing and still wore her +4s. She stood in front of the blazing fire, steam rising from her damp tweeds, and embarked on a detailed and highly technical description of a recent stalk. Maisie Holler, at whose villa Marylda had been staying before she met Rowan, leaned forwards to listen with an air of absorbed interest, which made Georgina admit a little reluctantly that American women had better taste and manners than previous experience had led her to expect. She was fortunately unaware that in fact Maisie was mentally rehearsing the story to recount at future parties, in which such phrases as a stag in velvet would lose nothing in the telling. A civil child, thought Georgina. Too much makeup, of course, but should I put a very little rouge tonight? Dear Marylda, it was so thoughtful of her to give me a dress from Paris. But shan't I feel a guy in violet velvet? She assembled her courage. My dear Georgina, if you could carry off Prussian blue, watered silk when you were 17, you can certainly play the dowager in velvet at nearly 70. I must remember to tell Agnes to clean my diamonds with methylated spirit and a toothbrush. Sandy, with his footmen in attendance, came to clear away the tea. He noticed with disapproval that because the foreign guests had spent the afternoon playing backgammon, instead of taking the opportunity of filling their lungs with good Highland air, they had done less than justice to the baps and hot scones for which he had polished the covered silver dishes. From 5:30 until 6 there was a somnolent interlude of spasmodic conversation, while who's familiar with the tradition waited for the now excuse the interruption. From 5:30 until 6 there was a somnolent interlude of spasmodic conversation, while those familiar with the tradition waited for the drinks tray to arrive, and the others wondered whether there was time for a nap before dinner. Marylda chatted with Maisie, recalling incidents of their debut, until she found that memories of the house on the Hudson were evoking Emilie. She hastily switched the conversation to the difficulties of housekeeping in countries still restricted by ration books. Maybe, Marylda, but you've done well for yourself, said Maisie, proud of her relationship and a trifle envious. Marylda looked at Rowan, whose tweed coat was nearly as old as the kilt of moss-dyed hunting Cairdry, yet who wore them with a distinction that none of the guests who had been born in cities could equal. Yes, I've done well, she said, and added to herself, please God, let me do as well for him. Sandy brought in the silver tray of before-dinner drinks, sherry, Tio Pepe and Amontillado in Waterford decanters. Glenlivet, for today no lesser whisky would be offered. Water in a jug, which family tradition maintained had been used by Prince Charles. A footman followed with a cocktail shaker and the gin, vermouth, ice and lemon peel that Marylda had insisted was no more than her friends could rightly expect. The lesser tray was placed on a side table, decently obscured by an arrangement of pink and white azaleas. Jock and Lassie, resenting this influx of strangers whose smell showed them were more familiar with the greenhouses in which dogs are unwelcome than with the moors where decent canines are respected, followed Sandy to the kitchen where their dinner would be waiting for them. Angela wagged her tail a little wanly, hoping that her mistress would take this as a sign that for her there was no urge to routine which could separate a properly affectionate dog from the object of her selfless devotion. Marylda scratched her behind the ear, which Angela took correctly as a sign that her lapse after a gorge of chocolates, which had caused her to be precipitately sick behind the bank of chrysanthemums, had been attributed to a visiting dachshund. The dressing gong resounded through the house. Rowan smiled to himself, knowing that one of the footmen would be reprimanded by Sandy in Butler's pantry for beating it as though it were a fire alarm. The women began to drift upstairs while the men settled down to another round of drinks. Marylda went to the kitchen to be assured by Mrs. MacTaggart that everything was in order, and then hurried to her room to make sure of a really hot bath before the supply could prove itself unequal to the strain of 30 extra. Before getting into the pine-scented water, she took 2 triple bromides to stave off the steadily increasing tension. Not until after midnight need she see what Emilie's ghost refused to recognize. If she allowed the virtue to enter her too soon, she might run out of energy. So far, everything had gone according to plan. No signs of fusage in either Rowan or Georgina, and everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves. Even the slight hitches in the arrangements had been all to the good, for they had prevented her from thinking too much about the real purpose of the party. Half an hour later, Rowan found her lying on the bed. "Headache, darling?" he inquired anxiously. She stifled a yawn. "Only a bit sleepy, so I thought I'd rest for a few minutes to cool off after my bath." "You'd better pop into yours in case the boiler doesn't stand the strain." "It ought to. There's a fire that could run an express train from here to Edinburgh without restoking." "Party still going well?" He grinned. "They seem pretty cheerful, which isn't surprising as they've got through 7 bottles of gin and 3 whiskey, not to mention sherry since tea. Did you see Sandy's face when one of your chums asked for scotch?" He drew himself up and inquired icily whether by chance he wished for drambuie, which is sometimes referred to as the Scottish liqueur. You could almost hear the inverted commas. The stable clock struck 7. "Oh, bother, I suppose I must get dressed. You'll have to do me up, darling. My dress has an almost Edwardian complexity of hooks." "Where's Elsie?" "I sent her to look after Maisie, who's quite helpless without her maid. Anyway, I'd rather have you to help me tonight. But you mustn't come in until I call you, because I don't want you to see me until I've decided on the right hairdo to go with my tiara." He reluctantly left her, and she heard water gushing into the bath. In fact, there was no decision to make as to the style of her hair, for in Emilie's desk she had found a sketch of the dress made by Worth for the other New Year's Eve ball. On the back of it had been several suggested coiffures, one of which had a pencil note beside it, "Shall use this one." It was this same sketch, with slight modifications, which Marylda had sent to Christian Dior as inspiration for the... Well, I think I'll read this last sentence again and then I'll give it a rest. On the back of it had been several suggested coiffures, one of which had a pencil note beside it, "Shall use this one." It was this same sketch, with slight modifications, which Marylda had sent to Christian Dior as inspiration for the elaborately draped white satin, which Elsie had so carefully laid out on the armchair by the fire. She was pale, but decided to use no rouge, only the lipstick which had been carefully matched with her nail varnish to echo the rubies. The Edwardian hair suited her. How lucky that the present fashion made it possible to dress the part of Emilie without seeming eccentric. Now don't start thinking of Emilie yet, or you will be so fussed by midnight that you won't be able to cope. Cope with what? Don't be silly. You've got to find out what happened to Emilie after her party. Until you make her recognize what keeps her here, you'll never be able to have this place as you want it to be. You'll never be yourself, instead of the niece of a ghost. She made herself concentrate on pining her hair until the triple mirror assured her that no improvement could be demanded. Then, still in her green velvet dressing gown, she lit a cigarette to wait for Rowan. It was the first time she had seen him in full dress, and for a moment she thought she was seeing Hector, whose portrait hung in Georgina's sitting room. Silver buttons shone on the black velvet double diamonds sparkled in the fold of the lace, jabot and the hilts of dirk and skene-doo. The red, grey and yellow of the dress tartan were repeated in the dice pattern of his stockings. Darling, how magnificent you look. So I'll stop this here and upload it. Have a lovely Wednesday.